The Old Farmhouse is a scary story about a bullied high school student who discovers that something very evil lurks beneath the surface of his family's old farmhouse. People in my small town tend to disappear when they venture too far off past the city limits. An abandoned farmland that sits between our town and the Florida Everglades, to be exact. This farmland, haunted farmland, some would tell you, has been off limits for the past 15 years. The official story goes that a little over 15 years ago, a farmer disturbed an ancient aquifer while digging a well. The water in the aquifer broke free and opened a sinkhole that swallowed him and his wife. The unofficial story goes that a farmer disturbed an ancient Native American burial ground while digging this well, and brought a curse upon himself, his family, and the entire town. Most people in the town know someone who has vanished after traveling too close to the old farm. Curiosity is dangerous, but over the past 15 years, our town has learned to mind our own business. It is common knowledge that you stay off the old farmland and no one gets hurt. Ever so often the state police will roll through, usually asking about hunters or campers that disappeared by the old farm. They never find anything and eventually lose interest. By the time they're 16, most guys have claimed to have spent the night out on the old farmland. Most lied about it, but no 16-year-old boy would admit they were terrified of the old farm. So the charade continues through the years. Guys would gang up and bully those who they suspected had never been to the farm. It usually ended up being me, the one that the other guys would gang up like a pack of wolves. I was the only guy in my high school that was always upfront about never visiting the abandoned farm. It was my family that owned the farm. It was my father who disappeared along with my mother. Only 3 years old at the time, and I moved in with my grandmother afterwards. I have always been regarded by the town as an outsider, someone to be pitied. Though they would never say it out loud, the town viewed me as somehow being responsible for the disappearance, despite me only being 3 years old at the time of the incident. High school was hell. The students, even the teachers, treated me as if I was a leper. Taunts and sneers and the occasional pushes and punches followed me throughout the day. By my senior year of high school, the bullies had perfected their art. A group of them would see me approach and loudly discuss the last time they had snuck out onto the farm. They would all talk about how easy it was to get onto the farm, and that only a true coward would be afraid to go. Then they would all turn to me and ask me why I haven't been out there. Everything changed that Halloween night of my senior year. Tommy Miller, the captain of the baseball team, rounded up his buddies and hatched a plan. They had a Halloween prank that would go down in history. Well, they were right. This town will never forget what happened that night. As usual, I was their target of choice. I can understand why. I had no friends to back me up. The teachers, how pretty much the whole town hated my family. No one would come to my defense. In fact, they all enjoyed a good laugh at my expense. The baseball team went to state finals last year, so Tommy and his buddies could get away with anything. I must give them credit. They put a lot of effort into planning their prank. They had the balls to kidnap me from the steps of my grandmother's house on Halloween night. I answered the door expecting to see a few kids in costumes their parents had bought from Walmart. Instead, I was greeted by 3 giants wearing grotesque clown masks. The tallest clown, whose clown makeup was done up like Pennywise from the movie It, pulled me out of the house and pushed me down the front steps and onto the grass. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and of course I tried to run, but there was no running from Tommy Miller. He was a top University of Florida recruit. He caught up to me easily and knocked me over, giving me a good kick in the stomach as he taunted me. "Cowering like the dog you are," he said, before bending down and putting a burlap sack over my head. I could smell the beer on their breath as they shoved me into the back of their Ford SUV. "We're gonna scare the coward out of you tonight, boy," said one of Tommy's buddies. Probably Tommy Ripper, judging from the Mississippi drawl. The others in the car snickered, and Tommy said, "Pass me a beer." A cooler opened somewhere in the front of the SUV, and soon the SUV was filled with the smell of cheap beer. It didn't take a genius to guess where we were going. Life in this town revolved around stories about the old abandoned farm, even though no one rarely ventured close to it. The bumpiness of the ride told me that the SUV had turned off the main road and onto the neglected farm road that led to the farmhouse. After another 5 minutes or so, the SUV pulled to a stop. Tommy and his friend jumped out of the SUV, whooping and hollering. "Get him out of there, boys," Tommy yelled. The trunk opened and a pair of strong hands grabbed me by the shoulders and yanked me out of the truck and onto the ground. I slowly stood up and started to take the hood off, but was interrupted with a swift punch to the stomach. "What the hell you think you're doing?" yelled Todd as he pulled me to my feet again. "Do what you're told and maybe we won't post this video on YouTube," Tommy said. Well, my reputation in this town cannot get any worse, so that was an idle threat. I stood as still as possible, hoping to avoid giving them another reason to hit me. I thought to myself, do what they say, don't make them angry. Maybe I could run away if they got too drunk or became distracted. Tommy said, "Okay, let's get going, don't have all night here," and roughly pushed me forward. I did what I was told and slowly put one foot forward and then the other, carefully taking each step as trying not to fall. "Come on, you wuss, walk faster," said a new voice that I didn't recognize. "I can't see where I'm going. I'd be able to go much faster if I didn't have this hood on," I said softly, as not to give them any reason to punch me again. Someone grabbed my hood and ripped it off, taking some of my hair with it. I looked up to see Chris Hempley, my next-door neighbor, my best friend throughout elementary school, holding the hood. He had stopped talking to me in 8th grade, an age when popularity in girls went out over childhood friendship. Just as I suspected, they had taken me to the old farmhouse. The abandoned farmhouse stood in front of us, creepy as hell and lit up by the fog lights of Tommy's SUV. Graffiti covered the walls of the house, and broken glass lay beneath shattered windows. Decades of trash and debris lay shattered around the overgrown lawn. Chris dropped the hood and said, "What the hell are you looking at, punk?" My nose wrinkled at the smell of beer-soaked breath. Chris bent over and opened the cooler that Todd had taken out of the truck. Chris picked out a beer and handed it to me. "Here, drink one of these. There still might be hope for you yet," he said. They all laughed and Todd held up his phone. "Let me get this on video. Baby's first beer. Chug it." I did what they told me to, cracking open the can, tilting it up, and slowly drinking down the watery beer. "Amateur hour. Let us show you how it's done," Todd said. They all picked up 2 beers each and chugged them as quickly as they could. Todd picked up another one and was about to hand it to me when Tommy cursed him and said, "Why the hell are you letting this clown drink with us? What happened to the plan? We can't let him off this easy." Chris shifted uneasily and said, "I didn't think you were serious, man. He could get hurt, or worse." Todd laughed and said with a slur, "Ooh, you trying to protect your kindergarten buddy? Man up or go home. The road is that way," said Tommy as he pointed over his shoulder with his thumb. Chris looked down to the ground, but didn't say anything. I knew I was in trouble, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what Tommy had planned for me. "Todd, get the rope out of the truck. Let's get going. I don't want to be here all night. I want to get to the party before the keg runs out," Tommy said. Todd stumbled over to the back of the SUV in a drunken stupor, but couldn't figure out how to open the trunk. "Damn it," muttered Tommy through clenched teeth as he stomped over to the back of the SUV. I knew that was going to be my only chance. I didn't want to stick around to find out what Tommy had in store for me. I slowly began to back away from Chris, who looked at me but said nothing. I silently thanked him and spun around and sprinted off into the darkness. 30 seconds later, I heard a loud curse and knew that Tommy had saw that I ran off. I had to find some place to hide since there was no way I could outrun them. The problem is there isn't any place to hide on a farm. Wide open land surrounded the farmhouse where I was running away from. Tommy tackled me 2 minutes later at the edge of the small pond where my father had tried to dig the well so many years ago. Tommy pushed my face into the ground and twisted my arms behind my back. "Give me that rope now, Todd," said Tommy. Todd, breathing heavily from the run, looked like he was going to throw up. All that beer sloshing around in his stomach, I guess. Tommy tied my hands behind my back tightly, the nylon rope digging into my wrist and cutting off circulation to my hands. He held the other end of the rope in his hands. He gave the rope a jerk and said, "You're not going anywhere now. Got you on a leash like the coward that you are." I stood facing Tommy and Todd and saw Chris walking up from behind them. He was about 15 feet away when the earth beneath his feet dropped a few inches, and a pale hand with blackened fingernails reached up from the damp soil and grabbed onto Chris's ankle and jerked downwards. Chris screamed and jumped forward, managing to free his ankle from the grasp of whatever lay beneath him. Tommy looked back and said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" "Something grabbed my foot back there. I think my ankle sprained," said Chris, winching as he touched his ankle. Junior said, "You're starting to sound more like this little coward here. You snagged your foot on a root. You've had too many beers, you lightweight." Chris began to say something, but stopped when two grotesque hands began to come up from the ground and grab both of Chris's ankles, slowly pulling him down into a widening hole. Chris screamed and tried to rip his legs free, all the while sinking deeper into the soil. Tommy and Todd ran over there, each grabbing one of Chris's hands. "Pull!" Tommy yelled. Chris's screams intensified, now waist down into the ground. His eyes bulged as blood began to trickle from his mouth. "Todd, pull, damn it!" screamed Tommy, with a panicked look in his eye. Together they pulled and brought Chris back out of the narrow hole. His left leg was broken, and his right leg looked like what was jagged bite marks running up and down it. I stood up and took a few steps forward. They had pulled Chris out of a small tunnel with smooth, oily walls that went down about 4 feet before taking a 90-degree turn towards the old farmhouse. "Use this rope to stop the bleeding," I said, as I looked down at his legs. Chris, with his eyes glazed over, lay there moaning on the ground, and Tommy looked at me for a moment before untying my hands and wrapping the rope tightly around Chris's leg. "Todd, you got your phone on you?" asked Tommy. I think it's back of the truck," slurred Todd. "Mine too. Run back and get them both. Bring them back to me. I'll wait here and watch over Chris." Todd hesitated for a moment, looking down at Chris, and then off to the SUV in the distance. Tommy cursed and threw his empty beer can at Todd. "What the hell are you waiting for? Get going," he said. Todd zigzagged across the open field, hopping and skipping and doubling back every few feet, trying to avoid whatever horror lurked beneath him. He finally reached the SUV, and a few minutes later began hopping and skipping his way back towards us. Todd was about 10 feet away when he abruptly disappeared. Tommy, his face ghostly white, said to me, "Go see what happened." I took 3 long strides forward and saw that Todd had disappeared into a hole that looked just like the hole that they had pulled Chris out of. It went down about 4 feet, then veered off towards the old farmhouse. Tommy looked down at Chris lying on the ground and took 2 long steps to look into the hole that Todd disappeared into. He said to me, "Walk towards the truck slowly. I'll follow behind you. I'll break your legs if you try to run and leave you here. You hear me?" "Sure," I murmured, and then I said, "What about Chris?" Chris had regained consciousness and began to plead with Tommy to take him with us. Tommy refused, saying to Chris, You're safer here. Trust me on this, man." Chris screamed, "No, no, no," then looked at me with this look of pure terror on his face. "You have to listen to me. They're coming back for me. I can hear them slithering underneath us. Listening, waiting until I'm alone." Tommy looked at Chris and then turned to me and shoved me towards the SUV. "Start walking slowly," he said. I began to walk forwards, concentrating on each step. I could hear Chris behind us begging for us to come back, and then nothing. I didn't dare turn around and look, but I heard Tommy curse, and I knew that Chris was 4 feet beneath us. "Hurry up and get to the truck, and we can get out of here together," Junior said, as he gave me a hard shove. I doubted that Tommy would take me with him. He would probably leave me here to suffer the same fate that Chris and Todd did. He would likely find a way to blame me for their disappearances. I knew, though, that running off would be the worst thing I could do. I decided to go along with Tommy and hoped that an opportunity for escape would present itself. We were a few steps away from the SUV when I felt the ground beneath my feet rise half an inch, then rapidly sink. I jumped backwards, away from the SUV, just as a huge hole formed that swallowed the entire vehicle into a bottomless pit, 30 feet across. "My truck! It got my damn truck!" screamed Tommy, with more emotion than when Chris and Todd had disappeared into the ground. He turned on me and punched me in the side of the head. "This is all your fault. If you wouldn't have run away from us, this wouldn't have happened. You're gonna pay for this." He grunted as he punched me in the mouth, this time knocking me to the ground. I turned over, spitting blood out of my mouth, and I kicked him as hard as I could in the groin, and then I ran into the old farmhouse. "I'm going to kill you," Tommy screamed after me with a hysterical laugh. I knew that he would kill me if he got a hold of me, so I ran through the abandoned house looking for the basement door. Memories from my childhood came rushing back as I ran through the farmhouse. If I could find some place to hide, to wait him out, then I might be able to get out of this alive. The first door I tried led into a closet, but the second door opened into the pitch-black basement. I ran down the wooden steps, hoping that the old wood would hold up under my weight. Then I heard Tommy crashing through the front door of the farmhouse. I felt around the basement, searching for a good place to hide myself. I found a small alcove near the old coal chute and draped an old canvas around my body and sat huddled in the corner of the damp basement. The footsteps stopped above me, and I knew that Tommy had found the door to the basement. The steps of the basement began to groan under his weight, and a sharp crack and a loud curse told me that the rotted steps had buckled under Tommy's weight. My eyes adjusted to the small amount of moonlight shining in the basement through the boarded-up windows. A faint outline of a limping Tommy came into sight, one hand out in front of him, blindly feeling around. On the other hand, he held what looked like a crowbar. He called out, "Why are you hiding? I just want to talk. I know how we can get out of here, if we work together." I watched Tommy hobble across the basement and kept deathly silent, looking for a chance to sprint up the stairs and out of the farmhouse. My heart missed a beat when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye on the other side of the basement. In the darkness, I could see 2 black figures crawling out of a hole in the wall and pull 2 bodies out of the hole behind it. They hit like a bag of concrete on the floor. Tommy twirled around towards the sound, a crowbar raised above his head. "I know that's you, you damn coward." One of the bodies on the floor moaned and gasped. "Tommy, they ate my eyes. They ate them. Help me, please." I ripped off the canvas and sprinted up the stairs carefully to avoid the broken stair, praying that the other ones would hold up. I reached the top of the staircase, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. I soon heard footsteps crashing up the stairs and watched the doorknob rattle. I knew I should run away while the creatures below were occupied, but morbid curiosity kept my eyes glued on the door. "Hey, open the door. They're at the bottom of the stairs. Oh God, they're horrible, disgusting. You should have seen what they did to Chris and Todd. Please." I heard Tommy yell. I stood there silent. Tommy cursed and drove the crowbar through the wooden door again and again until there was a hole large enough to fit his hand through. He reached through and twisted the lock open. His hand spasmed, and a sickening crunch followed by a god-awful scream. The door swung open slowly, and Tommy came into view. Blood gushed down the side of his face, and a large bite mark where his left eye used to be. He took a step forward, looking at me with the remaining eye, until a rotted hand with sharp black fingernails wrapped around his ankles and pulled him back into the black basement. The door closed with a loud bang, which awoke me from my trance. I sprinted out of the farmhouse and back towards the main road, blocking out the shrill of screaming rising out of the basement and ignoring the fact that the grotesque hand that grabbed Junior's ankle wore the same turquoise ring that I had seen in my father's old photographs. The Undertaker is a creepy story about a man who owns a funeral parlor in a small town. Bernard Sloan had the perfect family. They were always there, waiting for him when he finished work. Every evening at 7 o'clock, he put out the lights, locked the front door, and went downstairs to the basement to spend the evening with his family. His wife Jenny would be sitting on the couch knitting a sweater. His mother was always dozing in her easy chair. His son Ben and his daughter Emma were usually sitting at the table playing a board game. Little Luke lay on the floor playing with his toys, while little Martha, the youngest, sat at the piano. Bernard would sit down in his big comfortable chair and chat with them until bedtime. He told them all about his day and who had died recently in town. He would repeat funny stories and jokes he had heard and told them his views and opinions on any subject that came to mind. They always listened patiently and never argued or contradicted him. When it was time to go to bed, Bernard would yawn and stretch his arms. He would go around the living room giving them all kisses on the cheek and saying, "Well, good night, everyone. Pleasant dreams." Then he would turn out the lights, climb the stairs, lock the door behind him, and went to bed. Middleton was a small town, and Bernard was the only undertaker in the area. His funeral parlor was also his home, and he got all the business there was. Although he didn't have any close friends, he was well known and respected and above suspicion. Everything went like clockwork. People would bring their dead loved ones to him, and Bernard would embalm their bodies and prepare them for burial. The funerals were usually held in the local church, and the dead were buried in the local graveyard. One day, as Bernard was cleaning up the funeral parlor, a policeman came in the front door. "Can I help you, officer?" Bernard asked. "I'm here about the periwinkle child," the policeman said. Bernard had a puzzled look on his face. "The periwinkle child? Martha Periwinkle?" the policeman said. "The little girl who drowned 5 months ago." "Oh, yes, of course," said Bernard. "I remember now. Well, I'll level with you, Mr. Sloan. The body had been exhumed by the family, and when they opened the coffin, they got quite a shock. There was nothing but stacks of old newspaper inside." "Oh, my God," said Mr. Bernard. "How terrible." "Now look, Mr. Sloan," the policeman said. "Theft of a body is a criminal offense, and if you cooperate, we'll go easy on you. The family just wants their daughter's remains so they can give her a proper burial." Bernard was highly offended. "I've been doing business in this town for 20 years, he said. "Everybody knows me. How could you think I would do such a thing?" "Then you won't mind if I search your house," the policeman said. Bernard's face suddenly turned pale. "I certainly do," he said. "This is my home as well as my place of business. I know my rights as a citizen." I'm not going to have anybody snooping through my private property without a search warrant." "If that's the way you want it, that's fine with me," said the policeman. "I'll be back in an hour with a search warrant. In the meantime, I'll leave an officer outside to make sure you don't try to get rid of any evidence." Bernard watched as the policeman turned and left. He shut the front door, stood there thinking for a few minutes. Then he went downstairs to the basement to see his family. He opened the curtains and lit some light into the room for the first time. His wife was still knitting. His mother was still dozing on the couch. Ben and Emma were still playing their board game. Luke was still playing with his toys, and Martha was still at the piano. Somehow they all seemed a little withered, less like living people and more like mummies. Only Martha, the new girl, looked as fresh as she had been on the day she drowned. Bernard let out a deep sigh. He picked up a container of gasoline and began splashing it around the basement. He splashed it all over his wife, his mother, each one of his children. Then he kissed them all on the forehead, sat down in his chair. He loved them all so much, and he couldn't bear to see his family torn apart. He reached into his pocket, took out a box of matches. He selected one match, struck it, and the entire room burst into flames. "Pleasant dreams, everybody," he screamed as the fire engulfed him. "Pleasant dreams." The creature at the window. Many years ago, there was an old one-story house that stood at the top of a hill. The locals called it Pagan Hills, and only 3 people lived there, a girl and her 2 brothers. One hot summer night, they were all sitting at the veranda, enjoying the cool air. They watched the sunset as the moon rose over the trees. They decided to go to bed. A few hours later, the girl was lying in bed and unable to sleep because of the heat. She was gazing out the window, watching the moon move across the sky, when suddenly something caught her eye. She saw 2 small lights moving through the trees near the graveyard and at the bottom of the hill. They looked like the eyes of some strange animal, but she couldn't make out what kind of animal it was. She kept her eyes on the woods, and then something stepped out of the shadows, something ghastly. It was coming up the hill and towards the house. For a few minutes she lost sight of it. It was coming across the lawn and towards her window. It looked something like a man, and yet it didn't. As she watched it, the most uncontrollable horror seized her. She wanted to run from her room, but the door was right next to the window, and she was afraid the creature would see her. She wanted to scream, but it felt like her tongue was glued to the roof of her mouth. She rushed to the door, but before she could open the lock, she heard scratching at the window. When she turned around, she saw a hideous sunken brown face with flaming eyes glaring straight at her. She tried to scream, but she was so frightened that she couldn't make a noise. The creature broke a pane of glass in the window. Then it reached in with long claw-like bony fingers and unlocked the window and crawled inside. The girl tried to escape, but the creature caught her by her hair and dragged her over to the bed, then pulled her head back and sank its teeth into her throat. She let out a blood-curdling scream and fainted. When her brothers heard her scream, they rushed to her room, but they couldn't get in because the door was locked. By the time they managed to break down the door, the creature was gone. Their sister was lying unconscious on the bed, bleeding from the wound on her neck. While one of the brothers grabbed towels and tried to stop the bleeding, the other took off after the creature and chased it down the hill. The thing fled through the moonlight, taking enormous strides, and soon he lost sight of it near the graveyard. The brother went back to the house to see if he could help his sister. The girl was scared and badly hurt, so they took her to the local doctor, where her wounds were disinfected. The doctor put bandages around her neck, but she had to stay in bed for a few days. Gradually, the wound began to heal, and the doctor said she was well enough to go home. The brothers reported the attack to the police, but they couldn't figure out what had happened. They said it was probably a lunatic who escaped from the local asylum. The brothers didn't want their sister to stay in the same room, but she insisted. After all, she said, lunatics don't escape from the asylum every day. But just in case, the brothers slept in the room across the hall and kept loaded pistols by their bedside. Winter passed peacefully, and finally spring came. But one night, a couple of months later, the girl was awakened by scratching at the window. Winter passed peacefully, and finally spring came. But one night, a couple of months later, the girl was awakened by a scratching sound at the window. When she opened her eyes, she saw the hideous brown sunken face staring in at her. This time, she screamed as loud as she could. She screamed with all her might, and her brothers grabbed their pistols and came running. The creature took off, but the brothers chased it down the hill. One of them took aim and fired a shot at it, hitting it in the leg. The creature fell over, but it got up and managed to limp over to the graveyard wall. The brothers watched as it scrambled over the wall and seemed to disappear into an old burial vault. The next day, the girl and her brothers went down to the church and demanded that the priest open the burial vault. Inside, there was a terrifying scene. The coffins had been broken open, and bones and rotting flesh were scattered all over the floor. Only one of the coffins had been left intact. When they opened it, there lay the same hideous, withered, shriveled creature that had attacked the girl. When the priests examined the corpse, they found a bullet in its leg. They did the only thing they knew to rid themselves of a vampire. The priests built a roaring fire outside the vault. Then the brothers dragged the sunken body and tossed it into the flames. They watched the corpse burn until there was nothing left but its ashes. The cradle that rocked itself. It was a dark and stormy night along the coastline of Maine. The wind rattled the doors and the windows of the house that dotted the cliffs that overlooked the raging ocean. The fierce wind crashed the waves violently against the rocks along the shoreline that lay below. Several ships that had been caught in the storm struggled to survive. In one warm cottage that was set high up on a cliff, a young woman was cooking dinner when she paused and turned towards her husband. "Did you hear that?" Her husband tapped his pipe gently and looked up from the table. "No." "I thought I heard a baby crying." He shook his head. "It's probably just the wind." Seeing his wife's concerned look, he continued, "Or it could be them seals. You know how those baby seals sound like human babies." His wife looked him in the eye. "I think I know the difference between a human and an animal cry." The husband shook his head kindly. "How could it be? In this storm?" Neither of them went out to check. The two sat and ate their supper in silence. Being newlyweds and expecting a baby of their own soon, they couldn't get the sound of a baby crying out of their head. The next morning, as the newlywed couple walked along the beach, they sadly surveyed several items that had washed ashore from one of the unfortunate ships that had broken into pieces against the rocks that night. The husband spotted a cradle. The storm had battered it about, but it was mostly intact. He picked up the stray pieces and took it home where he repaired it. In the following months and years, the couple used this cradle for their own babies. They often noted a very odd occurrence. When there was a storm and the wind blew outside, the cradle would rock itself. Sitting on the floor in the couple's warm living room, the cradle would rock as if someone was sitting next to it and gently rocking the baby. This happened frequently, and since the babies seemed to enjoy it, the couple paid it no mind. With the birth of their last child, the wife's sister came to visit. The family gathered at the kitchen table to eat supper. The proud aunt glanced into the next room with surprise in her eyes. "Who is that woman rocking the cradle?" The father looked and then turned to his sister-in-law. "What woman? There is no woman. The cradle rocks by itself. There is a woman. She has long dark hair. She pointed towards the other room. She is sitting next to the cradle and rocking your baby. The couple rushed to the door that separated the kitchen from the family room. The cradle was indeed rocking by itself, but there was no one there. The wife quickly went to the cradle and picked up her baby. The husband took the cradle outside and broke it to pieces against the rocks. He put the pieces on the wood pile. In the following weeks, as the couple burnt the pieces of the cradle in the fireplace, the wife could hear a wailing baby cry in the distance. After all the pieces of the cradle had been burnt, the wife never heard the baby cry again. The Finder. The Finder is a spooky story about a man who has an uncanny knack for tracking down lost items and missing people. Seymour Bellow had a strange knack for finding things that other people had lost. He became well known around town for his ability to track down anything that had been misplaced. Once, while on a picnic in the park, a wealthy woman dropped her gold brooch. While asking a single question, Seymour walked into the park, groped around through the grass, and produced the missing brooch. When anybody asked him how he did it, Seymour would just reply with a smile, "I got a knack for this kind of thing." Often, when he recovered someone's cherished or valuable possession, they would be so grateful that they would insist on giving him a small reward. Sometimes his uncanny ability would lead him to find money that people had dropped in the streets, which he would keep for himself. This was his only source of income, because most of his life he had never done an honest day's work. His wife, Marcia, was fed up with his irresponsible behavior and grew tired of barely having enough money to put food on the table. She constantly nagged him, demanding to know when he was going to stop being lazy and find a real job. Whenever she criticized him, Seymour would fly into a rage and storm out of the house, slamming the door behind him. It wasn't long before Seymour's strange knack for finding things became the talk of the town, and he found himself in great demand. Now and then the police would even contact him and ask him if he would provide his services for a small fee. They would call him the Finder. One day a middle-aged woman went missing while out for a walk, and when the police couldn't track her down, they turned to Seymour for help. Within a few hours he made his way out to the lake and discovered the woman's dead body floating face down in the water. She had been crossing a bridge when she must have lost her footing and fell in. While Seymour was basking in his newfound fame, his wife was telling him he was the worst husband any woman could wish for. He never repaired the house, never bought her new clothes, and never made enough money to buy her a dinner at a restaurant. Seymour began to find it very difficult to control his temper in the face of his wife's criticism. As time went on, their argument became worse and worse. Seymour longed to be rid of his wife and dreamed of spending the rest of his life as a single man. He couldn't remember why he had gotten married in the first place and wished she would just drop dead. That way, he could collect a large amount of money from her life insurance and could live comfortably for the rest of his days without ever having to work again. It was on a hot, humid summer night in the middle of June that Seymour received another phone call from the police. They told him that an 18-year-old girl had gone out alone on the river with her father's speedboat and hadn't returned. The police managed to recover the speedboat, which had been damaged, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. They said she had been missing for 3 days. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" growled Seymour. An hour later, he was walking up and down the banks of the river. Shaking his head, he led the police officers down a marshy spot at the end of the river. There he found the missing girl's body. She was floating in the muddy water, hidden by plants and weeds. Her corpse had been partially devoured by animals. The chief of police thanked Seymour and shook his hand. "Without you, we would never have found her," he said. "At least now her parents can give her a decent burial." That night, when Seymour arrived home, he found his wife packing her bags. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded angrily. "I'm leaving you," announced Marcia, her eyes wet with tears. "I can't stay here a moment longer with a lazy, shiftless, good-for-nothing like you." "You're not going anywhere," Seymour screamed. His face turned bright red and his hands began to shake with rage. "You're my wife. That means I own you. The only way you'll leave me is in a pine box." "I cursed the day that the priest pronounced us man and wife," she cried. "My father warned me you'd never amount to anything, and he was right, God rest his soul." With that, Marcia wrenched the wedding ring from her finger and threw it at him. Something inside Seymour snapped. The years of seething anger and resentment finally boiled over. He flew into an instant rage and attacked his wife, his fists flailing wildly. She tried to fend his blows, but the poor woman was no match for him. By the time Seymour's anger was spent, his wife lay dead at his feet. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, Seymour was terrified. He didn't want to go to jail. After a few panicked moments, he began to formulate a plan. First, he unpacked his wife's suitcase and placed her things back in the closet. Then he cleaned up the room, making sure that there was no signs of a struggle and nothing was out of place. He didn't want to give them any reason to suspect him. A few hours later, under the cover of darkness, he rolled his wife's corpse in an old piece of carpet, carried her out to the door, and threw her in the back of his truck. Then he drove out to the lake and parked by the water's edge. Ensuring there was nobody around, he dragged the dead body out of the truck and rolled it into the murky water. He watched as his wife sank beneath the surface and, with a smile on his face, waved goodbye. The currents would carry her out to the middle of the lake, he guessed. He bundled up her hat and coat and tossed them as far as he could. They landed on the water and floated away. The police would find them and assume his wife had drowned. His dark deed accomplished, Seymour drove home, humming a happy tune to himself. He poured himself a drink and waited for the dawn to arrive. Then he called the police and reported his wife missing. Although he had no training as an actor, he was able to convey the right level of fear and concern. When the police came out to interview him in person, he managed to act as if he was genuinely worried about his wife's well-being. He told the police that the last time he had spoken to her, she had mentioned that she was planning to pay a surprise visit to her friend who lived on the far side of the lake. "When she didn't come home last night, I thought the worst," he said, holding his head in his hands. "Don't get yourself all worked up, Seymour," advised one of the police officers. "I'm sure she'll show up safe and sound." The next day, Seymour received a phone call from the chief of police. He sounded uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to have to break this to you, Seymour," he said, "but I think your wife may have drowned. We found her hat and coat floating on the surface of the lake." Seymour let out an anguished sigh. Attempting to play the grieving husband, the chief of police paused for an appropriate time. Then he continued, "Do you think, under the circumstances, you might be able to lend us a hand? I mean, I know it's a difficult time for you, but—" "Of course," said Seymour, trying to sound as if he was holding back tears. "It'll be hard going, but I'll find her, and this time I won't charge you a fee," he said. Late that afternoon, Seymour drove out to the lake once again and met the police at the dock. They provided him with a boat, and he rowed out to the middle of the lake. As the boat drifted to a standstill, he switched his flashlight on and moved it back and forth over the water. He leaned out over the side and peered down into the murky depths. There, just visible below the surface, was a white and bloated hand. He could see it clearly, and the fingers waved back and forth with the motion of the wave. It was a woman's hand. Seymour turned and yelled to the police waiting on the dock, "Over here! I found her!" Suddenly, the woman's hand shot out of the water and grasped him by the hair. Before he had time to react, he jerked out of the boat and tumbled head over heels into the lake. He began thrashing about in the water, his arms flailing wildly, but he couldn't escape her clutches. The hand dragged him down, and his head disappeared beneath the water, leaving just a ripple on the water's surface. On the dock, the police officers saw Seymour fall into the water. They scrambled to another boat and quickly rowed out to help him. By the time they reached the spot, it was all over. When they fished Seymour's dead body out of the water, another corpse came with it. The white and bloated remains of a woman were clinging to him by her arms. Her decomposed arms were wrapped around him, her nails digging into his flesh. The police officers were horrified at the sight. The finder had finally found the dead body of his wife, or maybe she finally found him.